Imagine this. You go to court. You're found not guilty of a crime, but then the judge tells you that you still have to pay a massive amount of money. Sounds completely backwards, right? Well, today we're going to break down the real-life case where that exact thing happened.
Okay, so let's get right into it. A man is acquitted, found totally not guilty of writing a bounced check, but every single court orders him to pay the full amount anyway, a whopping 436,800 pesos. So, how on earth is that possible? How can you be innocent of a crime, but still be on the hook for the cash? That is the legal puzzle we're going to solve together right now.
So this whole story revolves around two key players. On one side, you have Benjamin De Leon Jr., who's the managing director of a company. And on the other, you have Roqson Industrial Sales, the supplier he was doing business with. What should have been a totally normal transaction ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court.
All right, so let's rewind a bit. How did a simple business deal for some diesel fuel spiral into a case for the country's highest court? Well, it all started with one single post-dated check that went very, very wrong.
Here's the setup, and it's pretty straightforward. Roqson supplied fuel to De Leon's company, which was called RB Freight. Now, I want you to pay really close attention to this next detail because it is literally the key to the entire case. De Leon wrote the check from his own personal bank account, not a company one. We're going to see exactly why that's so important in just a minute.
And we're not talking about some small amount here. Over 400,000 pesos. I mean, that's a serious chunk of change. And it's this exact figure that became the centerpiece of a legal battle that went on for years.
So as you probably figured, when Roqson went to deposit that check, it bounced. And the reason from the bank was pretty final. Account closed. And that, right there, is the moment this business deal turned into a full-blown legal war. Roqson immediately sued De Leon for violating the bouncing checks law.
But this is where the story gets really strange. As the case started moving through the court system, this bizarre and confusing pattern began to pop up. Okay, check this out. First, it goes to the Metropolitan Trial Court. They acquit De Leon of the crime, but tell him he still has to pay the money. So he appeals. The case goes to the Regional Trial Court. They agree, yep, you're not guilty of the crime, but you still got to pay. So he appeals again. The Court of Appeals lands on the exact same conclusion. 3 acquittals, 3 orders to pay. The only place left to go was the Supreme Court.
Let's just pause on that for a second. At every single level of the court system, Benjamin De Leon was declared not guilty of the crime. So what possible legal reason could there be to keep forcing him to pay the civil debt? I mean, this is the core mystery that the Supreme Court had to figure out. And figured out they did. The Supreme Court's decision finally gave a crystal clear answer, and it all came down to some really fascinating legal details that, frankly, affect anyone who does business.
You know, when the highest court in the land makes a ruling, its job is to clarify the law for everybody. And their explanation here really gets to the very heart of this whole legal puzzle.
So, the court's answer starts with this really crucial idea. It turns out not all acquittals are the same. See, if you're acquitted because the court says you flat out didn't do it, you're not the author of the act, then any civil case tied to it just vanishes. But, and this is the big one, if you're acquitted because of reasonable doubt, which means the prosecution just couldn't prove its case to that super high criminal standard, well, the civil debt can absolutely stick around.
And this case is the perfect example. De Leon was acquitted of the crime because the prosecutors couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he ever got the official notice that his check had bounced. See, getting that notice is a key ingredient of the crime itself. Without proof he got it, there's reasonable doubt, so he had to be acquitted criminally. But that doesn't mean the debt just poof disappeared.
The court's ruling lays it out perfectly. Being acquitted of a crime based on reasonable doubt does not automatically wipe the slate clean on the civil side. Think about it this way. To prove a crime, you need evidence that's beyond a reasonable doubt. Let's call that being 99% sure. But to prove a civil case, you just need a preponderance of evidence, which is basically just being more than 50% sure. It's a way lower bar to clear, and that's exactly why the civil case was still alive and kicking.
Okay, so that makes sense. We get why a civil case can survive. But that leads us to the next massive question, right? The diesel fuel was for his company, RB Freight. The debt belonged to the corporation. So why was Benjamin De Leon being held personally responsible for paying it?
And the answer lies in this really powerful legal concept called the accommodation party. Basically, under the law, when you sign something like a check to lend your name and your credit to someone else, in this case, his company, you become what's known as an accommodation party. Honestly, the easiest way to get your head around this is to think about co-signing a loan for a friend. You're not the one getting the money from the bank, right? But you are putting your own good name and your credit on the line. You are personally guaranteeing that debt. And that is exactly what DeLeon did here for his company.
So let's connect all the dots. The court looked at it like this. 1. The debt clearly belonged to the company, RB Freight. But 2, DeLeon made the choice to write a personal check from his personal account. In that single action, he was lending his own personal credit to his company. That check became his personal promise to pay. He basically stepped out from behind the company's protective shield and made himself personally liable for the whole thing.
Now, the reason this whole story is so important is that it isn't just some weird, fascinating legal case. It has a huge lesson for anyone who owns a business, manages a company, or even just handles payments for an organization.
So here's the big takeaway, laid out plain and simple. If your company owes money and you decide to write a personal check to cover that corporate debt, bam, you have just legally volunteered to be personally responsible for it. The law sees your signature on that personal check as your personal guarantee. End of story.
Now, it's not all doom and gloom. The law does give you an out. As an accommodation party who ends up paying someone else's debt, you have the right to turn around and sue the party you accommodated to get your money back. So in this case, DeLeon can actually sue his own company, RB Freight, for reimbursement.
And that leaves us with one final, really important question that you should ask yourself. The next time you sign a check for your business, just stop for a second and think, whose promise am I making right now? Is this the company's promise to pay, or have I just made it my own? Because as we just saw, the answer to that question can make all the difference in the world.